What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. So I did want to talk about something today here on Motorfest, or I guess you could probably say this most likely has to do with a lot of gaming nowadays. That is going to do with the entire drip feeding thing we seem to be noticing a lot more in games now, and I do feel like a lot of people are probably going to be getting a bit annoyed with it, which honestly I do agree with. Now I'm sure a lot of people might be wondering exactly what I do mean by this, so if you guys might be wondering exactly what drip feeding is, we have been seeing this in something like Grand Theft Auto. We do know Motorfest is going to be doing it. Other games like Test Drive might even be doing it. And I'm sure there's most likely other games that will end up like showing you something like an update or what's coming out in that set update. They're going to show all the new cars or all the new items you can get, but you're only going to get a few of them in the beginning of the update, and then afterwards, probably every week or every month after that, they're then going to be giving you a car here and there or an item here and there that was already shown in the set update when it did end up coming out, but they're basically going to be feeding you these set items in that update throughout the entire season of the game, whether that's going to be 3 or 4 months or 5 months or whatever that season might be in the said game, which I would say most are probably 3 to 4 months, I think, in most games nowadays, but they would end up showing you something in that update, like, for example, this car is going to look dope. I really want to get that. You get really hyped for the update, but boom, you do end up logging on and finding out that that car doesn't come out for 2 months or something. And the weird part to me, though, is they are basically advertising all the items in there, showing how big the update is, all the amazing things that are coming, but they only give you like a piece of it, and then you have to wait for the other items to eventually come out. This is something I do know people are probably going to be very familiar with in GTA Online, to where they would end up having an update, all the new cars are going to be shown, or there's like an entire leak of like 10 different vehicles coming out over the course of like 2 months or something like that, to where they give you like a car a week. Sometimes they might even skip an entire week and then give you nothing and then give you a car after that, which is funny because I do remember in the earlier days of Grand Theft Auto, they didn't do that back then as much as they nearly are now. It's probably a way to go, okay, well, if we do end up doing like a drip feeding thing every single week, we have 7 or 8 cars there. It is then going to give players a chance to get something every week or log on, check it out if the vehicles are going to be coming out then, or they might be like, okay, well, it could look like something along the lines of giving them more content over time, even though it's originally supposed to come out with the main update that did end up getting released. And then players might be looking at this going, okay, so in order for me to get the car that I do want, even though they did end up having something about this in the update itself, I'm going to have to wait probably around 2 months to get this car that I do want, because they're basically drip feeding every vehicle. Sometimes I remember in GTA that if it was going to be a really good car or a car everybody did want, that one for some odd reason would be way farther into the drip feeding thing. Like instead of getting it the second week after the update, it would probably be like the 8th or 9th week, because they do know everybody wants it. So in some ways, maybe they'd push that out or something. But for me, guys, I gotta admit, I feel like a lot of people are going to look at something like drip feeding and most likely hate it. Do let me know in the comments below. I'm really curious to know your thoughts on this. Would you guys rather have everything in the beginning of the update, or would you rather them drip feed you content throughout the entire season that was supposed to be in that update, but instead they're basically releasing it to make it look like it's going to be content, quote unquote, even though it was originally part of that update, but they were like, okay, well, if we give them some of this each month, maybe it's going to look like more content's coming out. I feel like players are like, yo, no, no, no. Let's get everything the beginning of that set update. I'd rather have everything right there. Now, I would say people can argue that, well, maybe they might get boring or something like that if they have everything come out right away. Then again, I feel like everybody I've seen online pretty much wants it in that aspect, and not basically being drip fed to you or pretty much coming out or breaking up the entire update. Instead of giving every single car in that, you might only get like 4 or 5 right away, and then boom, you have to wait 4 months to get the rest of them. I feel like that's a very weird way to do it. Now, the thing is, I do understand Grand Theft Auto did this, but another game I was noticing players not happy about is going to be the Crew Motorfest, which is also doing this in some way. Even logging onto the game, guys, you're probably going to be in the loading screen of it. You're most likely going to see cars you can't get at the moment that are going to be coming out in around 2 or 3 months from now. I do understand they're probably trying to advertise that, maybe get you excited for it, but in some ways, doesn't that kind of destroy the hype in some way? Like if you know the car is obviously coming in a few months, you can go, go, okay, well then I won't play the game for 2 months until that car comes out or something. I feel like in a lot of ways, if they're showing you everything but then not releasing it on the said date, and they're probably going to be giving you like crumbs of pieces of it pretty much every month or every week, it is most likely going to hurt the hype or like the entire reason for you to play it until that said item does end up coming out. What I do find kind of weird about the drip feeding in Motorfest though is I guess, in some ways get why they're doing it. But then again though, they're probably trying to make it look like we're getting items throughout the entire season, as I mentioned before. And that way it's not going to look like we get everything right away and then it's just 3 months of nothing or something. Which, to be real, I'd rather have every single item on the main release date than not give me the car 3 months later. But hey, probably to each of their own. The one thing I found interesting though is even back in the Crew 2 guys, we would end up getting updates and stuff like that with vehicles coming out, and we would have the motor pass, all that stuff back then. But you know what was interesting? We never had a lot of drip feeding back then in that game. Like, I do understand in Motorfest they probably took this approach from some weird angle, but in the Crew 2 though, back then, at least in the earlier days when I was playing it, when the motor pass and stuff was in there, I do not remember them having a lot of drip fed type of stuff. Like, you get the motor pass, all the items are in it, you're then going to have like 4 different vehicles, you level that motor pass up, you get them, you're then also going to have the entire challenge thing with like these stories to where the cars are in there. You're not going to have to wait for a vehicle to come out. No, it's going to be tied to a challenge. That's the other thing. Instead of having cars being drip fed probably 2 months after the update, wouldn't y'all rather have it like it was in the Crew 2 to where it was tied to some type of challenge, or you had to go in, do a bunch of stuff, unlock the vehicle that way, but it's all in there on the initial release date, instead of having everything just randomly come out 2 or 3 months later? Like, I don't really understand it. On top of that, though, I also understood back then that they would end up giving you pretty much every vehicle right on the release date, and then afterwards they give you like an elite bundle or different things you can probably unlock. We all do know the vanity items always come out later on and stuff, but I do feel like having a bunch of the cars on the initial release of the main Red Bull update in Motorfest, they gave you, what was it, like 4 or 5 vehicles on the release when there was apparently like 17 of them. And with that though, is probably going to make players very curious to see what cars they're most likely going to end up adding, or maybe they might not even know what's going to be added. But here's the funny part though, heading into the menu of Motorfest here, head over to the Ocean and Sky playlist guys, head over to the custom mode. Everybody knows this already, but I wanted to show it. You're going to see the motocross insignia here and a jet thing. This is pretty much telling me that they're probably going to have this stuff most likely coming out, which is going to be very obvious. But, and there's a but there, we're going to have to wait for the jet and the motocross bike with the ski thing on it that we can use in the events to most likely come out mid-season in May. So my thing is though, which really kind of annoyed me a bit, is why is this even in here? Am I right? I mean, if we're looking at this, you know players are going to ask a bunch of questions like, oh, why is there a motocross thing here? Or why is there a jet sign? We're getting jets. And they were probably like, well, we'll put that in there, most likely part of this. But why did they not add this into it in the mid-season when we're originally supposed to get the jet and the motorcycle? Wouldn't that make a lot more sense? You're pretty much having people hyped up, but also they're like, yo, we gotta wait 2 months for these to be added. And you know what the funny part is I do know other people have been talking about this on videos, and other people have been mentioning this, like, yo, stop showing us everything right away. We want to be excited to see what is going to be added. And personally, I would also rather see that as well. Like, if they're going to show everything that's coming out in the update, why would you pretty much show everything right away, but pretty much lock maybe 70% of it out of, I guess, the main update when it does release? You pretty much put the other 70% of it pretty much into the other 3 or so months after when it does end up releasing. Like, does that really make any sense? Don't you all want to build up hype with players? Like, I feel like even on the custom mode thing with the jet and the motocross bike thing, I would have rather kept that completely off it, pretty much tried to hide that stuff. That way players are going to be massively surprised when it did end up releasing, instead of having that in there but the vehicles are not going to be in there until later. Kind of doesn't make any sense there, man. I feel like players are looking at that going, yo, I don't get any of this, bruh. And I'm most likely going to guess and say I'm probably not the only person most likely thinking about this stuff a bit. Like, I'd rather have everything coming out on the main release date instead of seeing everything pretty much come out slowly over the course of 4 months. Don't y'all think the entire drip feeding thing is kind of going a tad too far? I mean, I do know they're probably again trying to do that to make it look like they're releasing content throughout the entire season, but if you're going to be showing everything in the update, then basically cutting most of it out and then showing it or releasing it later, that just doesn't, I don't understand that. It's kind of weird to me. Like, I'd rather have the players being hyped up if you are going to have something crazy coming out, maybe like a mid-season update, then hide all of that until it is going to come out. That way it's going to make players even more excited. I don't really know if the entire Grand Theft Auto thing was going to be one of the main causes of drip feeding content in other games, but I do feel like they were probably doing it long before some of these other games were, and now I feel like other games are kind of maybe taking note of that, or maybe they're like, yo, that's not a terrible idea. Because again, in Motorfest, seeing that it was never a thing back in the Crew 2, at least when I can remember when the Motor Passes were out, they did have the Elite Bundles again, but I do not remember them locking a bunch of races behind like an entire season or whatever to where you can see them but you can't do them until later, or you're going to see a bunch of new cars but you can only use like 3 of them. They pretty much would give you a majority of all that stuff basically right on release. Then you might see like elite bundles or some special things here and there throughout that season, but you basically got everything in the beginning of that update, and it wasn't going to be shown or teased to you, then you have to wait 2 or 3 months for it. I just feel like the entire plan there really doesn't make any sense. But besides all of that though, I am curious to know what y'all think about this in the comments below. I have been noticing a lot more people talking about drip feeding content, how they're not a big fan of it. So I am curious to see what the comments are going to say on this. I'm willing to bet that more people would probably rather have this stuff coming out on the initial update day instead of seeing a bunch of it cut up than coming out 3 to 4 months after it. Just doesn't really seem to be working for a lot of people, or at least people aren't a fan of it, and I'm really starting to see that more and more at the moment.